It is finally time to talk about The Cauldron of Life by Caroline Logan. In case you don't know, The Cauldron of Life is actually the second book in the Four Treasures series, and I did a review of the first one called The Stone of Destiny, and I will link that in the description as well as in the cards in case you're interested. But before we actually get into this one, I should probably say that if you haven't read The Stone of Destiny, you might be spoiled in this video for some of the main plot points because this is obviously the second book in the series, but I will not be spoiling anything of The Cauldron of Life in this video, so if you haven't read The Cauldron of Life, don't worry, you're safe. But before we get into the actual review, I will give you a bit of a summary for what this book is about. So Harris is in trouble and it's up to Ailsa, Iona, Angus and Gris to save him. But while they're on that journey, Ailsa is trying to take control of her powers that she discovers that she's had since birth at the end of book one. She is doing that in the hopes that once they save Harris, she can save the world from Nick Nevin, who is the Fairy Queen and might also just be her mum. I felt the stakes were raised so high in this one. Obviously, if you read the end of the first one, you were probably expecting that anyway, but I was not expecting the extent of how high those stakes were raised. But my favourite thing about this book is that there's so much more magic and there's so much more Scottish folklore that's woven into the story, and it really made it so much more magical and interesting for me. I can't remember if I mentioned this in The Stone of Destiny, but I felt like the character development was really strong in that book, and it remains strong in this book. And the characters that we didn't see too much in The Stone of Destiny, we get to see in this book, and once again they are developed so well and they become so realistic as you read this. It feels like once again that you're there with them, going through the journey with them, and that is something I definitely got from the characters and the magic in this book. One of my favourite things about this is the magic and the Scottish folklore becomes so much more of a bigger part of the story, and that is something I really enjoyed because I love fantasy for the reason of magic and folklore. So I really loved that part, and I loved the characters that we got to see a bit more about in this book that we didn't see too much in the first book. And we are also introduced to some new characters, which once again I am in love with. I don't know how much I can say about these new characters without spoiling the book, but just know that there is this new character. His name's Malik, and he is the sweetest being I've ever read about. I feel like for this, the story was a lot more open in the sense that we follow the characters, but they all end up kind of splitting up a bit. Like we follow Harris, to be a little bit more specific without spoiling anything, we follow Harris in his struggle with being captured, and then we also follow Ailsa and Iona, Angus and Gris, and like all these different characters, and they're all in these different places. And although I love the Stone of Destiny and the way it was a very limited narration in the sense that we just follow the same three characters on their journey, I do think that was done really well. What I loved more about this though is the fact that we did get to see more of the world, and then we got to see more of like the cultures and the mythology and stuff like that. This is really hard to explain without spoiling things. But what I mean is when the characters break up, we see a lot more about the world, and we also get a much wider plot. So like it's not so closed in as the Stone of Destiny, and like I said, I did love the Stone of Destiny, but I felt like if this went the same direction with a little bit more of a closed plot in the sense that we kind of see like two sides of the story, Harris's side and then the group that's saving Harris, I feel like it wouldn't have been as interesting. I feel like the way that this has went and dealt with that part of the story was really like, it's exactly what the book needed and exactly what the series needed. The Cauldron of Life also interlinks classic fantasy with Scottish folklore, which when you read typical like classic fantasy stories, you do see some like classic Celtic folklore in there, but Caroline Logan makes it a bit more to the point and very obvious in the sense that these are classic Scottish stories, and she interlinks it with a classic fantasy vibe, but whilst doing that, she's creating this whole new modern fantasy that's a lot more interesting. And I'm not just saying that because I am Scottish, so I have a bias towards books with Scottish folklore, and I'm saying that because even without like your knowledge of Scottish folklore, you still get this whole new fantasy world that stands on its own away from like classic fantasy and Scottish folklore. So although it's clear that those inspirations are in there, it still stands on its own as this great fantasy story, and if you're into Scottish folklore or if you're into classic fantasy, I do think you would enjoy this. And the last thing I can say about this book without spoiling anything is that Caroline Logan is the best at cliffhangers and plot twists. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a few plot twists that once again is just so shocking and so brilliant. If you're someone who manages to predict plot twists easily, I challenge you to read this and try and pick the plot twist out of this, because you won't until it happens. And that is what makes this brilliant, is because you're always on the edge of your seat waiting to see what happens next. And again, there was a massive cliffhanger at the end of this book. I think we should make it an award for the best cliffhangers and plot twists in books, and then just give it to Caroline Logan, because my goodness. But it should be clear by now that I absolutely loved this book, and like I said at some point in one of my videos, I loved The Stone of Destiny. I gave it 5 stars, and I would give this one a 20 stars if I could, because I'm just so in love with it. I think it's a great sequel to the series. Like I said, it's definitely where the story needed to go, and I am still just excited for the third one as I was for this one, so that's always a good sign. Yes, I'm so excited. I was definitely a 5-star read, and I highly recommend this to anyone who is trying to get into fantasy, but also who really likes classic fantasies and maybe wants to experiment with something more modern, because it definitely interlinks classic fantasy with modern fantasy and Scottish folklore. So check this out if you haven't already. But that is all for my review of The Cauldron of Life. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, let me know by liking the video, and if you've read The Cauldron of Life, let me know in the comments. And if you fancy it, you can go follow me on all of my social media and go check out my book Selmy Noack. All my links for that is in the description of this video, as is the case with every video. I just keep forgetting to say it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. But anyway, that's all for this video, and I will see you soon for another one.